ASF. You've heard a lot about it here on this show. There's a lot of concern about the number of pigs that have had to be destroyed in places like China. China says they have the disease under control. Some skepticism comes with that, as I say that, from my standpoint and many, many others here on this side of the world. But what if it actually came to North America? What if there was an ASF outbreak, maybe not just in a place like Canada, but the U.S. as well? What would that actually look like? Our next guest has done some work and research on this and some modeling. It is Jayson Lusk. He is the department head of the Department of Agricultural Economics at Purdue University. Jayson, how's it going?
It's going well. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, great to chat with you. So, what did you discover in your modeling? How bad is this if it actually landed here?
Well, maybe I should first start by saying that there's a lot of uncertainty about what the possible effects here. So the strategy I tried to use was just lay out some ranges, under different scenarios of what, could happen depending on, how many hogs were affected in the U.S., what our trading partners did, how even domestic consumers responded. And so sort of tried to provide a bit of a range of possible economic outcomes. And, frankly, none of them are good, but they do vary from bad to really, really bad.
Okay, let's run through some of them. Let's hear what you found out.
So, if you consider, I hate to call this best case scenario, maybe the least bad scenario is, if you had a fairly, minor number of hogs that had to be either euthanized or killed or not enter the food supply, something around, say, 10% of the, U.S. herd, was removed. But also the upside is under this scenario, our trading partners don't, stop importing U.S. pork, and U.S. consumers don't respond. Even under that kind of fairly favorable scenario, U.S. producers would be worse off by about $1 billion. And even U.S. consumers would be worse off by about $1 billion. So, even under that fairly mild case, the economic implications are still fairly large.
And what would happen if there was a shutdown of trading relationships? That number has to really escalate in terms of economic losses.
It does, and it's kind of, it depends who we're talking about, but certainly for producers, the impacts get much larger. So even under that, say 10%, supply reduction. So about a little over 20% of all U.S. pork is exported. So that gives you, a sense of scale here. And so if you reduce those exports from 22% down to 0, and then you also are reducing, the herd by even 10%, now the losses to U.S. producers are about $3.6 billion. But of course, if the reduction in their herd is more than 10%, let's say 25%, now you're talking about, roughly $5 billion loss. So the implications for producers get much more severe under that scenario where, which I think is more likely that our trading partners would respond, even though, my understanding is that this is not a disease that affects humans. You can't import pork that has this, pathogen in it. It could, find its way to other pork facilities in other parts of the world. So that's one of the reasons I think trading, partners might throw up some barriers. One thing I will say about this scenario that's maybe a little, it's not counterintuitive, but it probably is not the first thing that comes to mind till you think about it. But if you look at the impacts in this scenario of we reduce the U.S. pork supply by some percentage, 10, 20, 50%. Our trading partners stop importing. Well, that actually could result in more pork on the U.S. market. And as a result, U.S. domestic prices could fall, and U.S. consumers, if assuming they're not bothered by this outcome, could actually be better off or, about even, because their prices fall pretty considerably because all this pork that used to be going to other places is now sitting here on the domestic market, causes prices to fall so they can more affordably buy more pork. So it kind of, that scenario of what happens to the U.S. consumer in that case, it really depends on, how much of the U.S. Pork supply is affected by this African swine fever. So that's sort of, something maybe that people don't initially think about.
I could only imagine how groups like PETA would have a heyday and use an ASF outbreak as leverage to try to convince people that it is not safe to eat pork.
Oh, sure. We've seen this in some other, kind of disease outbreaks we've had before where, the science seemed fairly clear that these, there were not human health implications, but of course that doesn't mean the avian, outbreaks that we've had in the past are kind of fall in this scenario, but it doesn't mean consumers don't. Doesn't mean, we all know consumers don't always pay attention to what the science says on these issues. And so indeed, that was sort of the last case scenarios I looked at, is like you have all the triple whammy here that, the disease hits, so you reduce supply, foreign, importers stop importing U.S. pork, and then, what happens if U.S. domestic consumption falls because for, like the scenario you described, or for whatever reason consumers think, I don't want to eat pork anymore, then it gets pretty bad. I think sort of the hopefully worst case scenario I considered is, if half the pork supply in the U.S. was reduced because of African swine fever, we lose our trading partners and consumer demand falls by, say, 10% in the U.S., then, you're looking at something close to $8 billion losses to producers and to consumers. I should say this is not just losses. This is not just like changes in revenue or expenditures. It's actually, what we, economists consider sort of economic welfare losses. So it's the closest thing on the producer side is something like profits. So to the extent there are profits for producers in the pork industry, that $8 billion number is not, just the reduction in revenue. It's, any economic surpluses that they were able to gain or profits they were able, those get, reduced by, my calculations suggest about $8 billion under that worst case scenario.
Oh, and we're assuming that's the worst case scenario. It's just, it's the numbers are scary. They go big quick. Okay. So considering an potential $8 billion loss for producers, and there's a range of losses in your model, mm-hmm. are we doing enough to prevent this level of devastation for the pork sector? Like we've heard lots about the Beagle Brigade. I know when I cross into the U.S. from Canada, there has been questions about countries I've visited, and I've asked the customs agent, is that question leading to finding out, if I'm a concern on something like an ASF, and the answer is yes. But is there more we should be doing?
Yeah, as you mentioned, I mean, it's not as if the industry's standing still. And indeed, I've been in some meetings where there's been a lot of discussions about what can we do, what should we do, even trying to figure out things like vaccines or, medicines or, things that happen even, maybe could help treat after the fact. But those things, frankly, just take some time. It just takes time, just like a lot of scientific enterprises, the answers aren't obvious. And, but, some research is being poured in there. And I think some of these things you mentioned, like, kind of ramped up border security is one thing that's being done here. I've been on a number of tours of farms over the last, 6 or 7 months. And, none of those hog producers let us into their barns. And I think for good reasons, exactly like this. It doesn't make the tour nearly as fun, but it's certainly, I think in situations like this, there's a very strong economic incentive to have strong biosecurity protocols in place. So, things are being done, but, I don't know. That's one of the reasons for sort of thinking about these numbers is, how much should you be, might some industry or group or government be willing to spend to prevent an outbreak like this? And, these numbers at least give you some sense of the scale. The challenge, of course, is it's like, it's almost like going to Vegas and playing a lottery. You just don't, there's some chance that $8 billion is the number is if it happens and the worst case happens, but that's got to be multiplied by some probability of whether it happens or not.
Yeah.
And, that's the big guess that, I don't think we really know.
mathematically impossible to eradicate all the risk. It's you could never, like, I think the point is you can never do enough, right? It's like an endless sort of quest to mitigate all the risks. And of course, we're in a year where the World Pork Congress or the World Pork Expo was put off for the year. So there's another example of a risk mitigation decision that was made. So finally, here to wrap up, what's been some of the feedback on your modeling?
Yeah, it's interesting. This is not some big sophisticated model. It's basically some supply and demand curves and plugging in some parameters and numbers to it. And so, one of the things, like a lot of this is, at least the feedback I've gotten is this number is way too big or this number is way too small, so you get kind of criticisms on both sides. But one of the things I did is, people want to go to my blog, just my name, JaysonLusk.com. I put a document with all the details and a spreadsheet. So you don't like my numbers, plug in, you think domestic demand is going to fall by 20%. Well, you can plug that number in, and try it for yourself. But I think that kind of relates a little bit to this uncertainty about the possible size of the effects. Is that there's just a lot of differences of opinion about what the potential impacts could be, and some people think they're even larger than this, or some other people think it's maybe a little too aggressive.
Well, we won't know unless it happens, and I can speak for I think everybody in the North American pork sector. Let's hope it doesn't happen.
That's what I was going to say.
I don't want to find out.
Hopefully I agree. Yeah, let's just hope it doesn't happen.
I know Jayson Lusk is a smart guy. I don't need this to prove that his modeling was correct. So exactly. Hey, and Jayson mentioned it. You can go to JaysonLusk.com and check it out. It is JaysonLusk.com. Hey, Jayson, I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
That is Jayson Lusk of Purdue University.